Well, thanks so much for having me and being part of the Playing Model Symposium. I've titled this presentation Image Deep, Design Frameworks for Ecological Vibrancy. And I will introduce a series of computational design methods that mark shift from procedural kind of simulation processes and behaviors towards thinking through these processes as kind of an image-based generation, and it's reading and that reads it as performative interpretation augmented through AI with a primary focus of machine learning or generative AI. So in this context, the use of the generative AI is directed more towards control rather than hallucination, connecting physical material research to spatial models and large-scale natural processes. In context of these regenerative material thinking, that is investigated more through empirical knowledge, kind of a human-based tactile knowledge. Knowledge is a form of attunement, and here the attunement is drawing on Timothy Morton's concept of the form of knowledge that he articulated in his writing on dark ecology. There we go. First, I'd like to introduce the context of research and collaborative practice. Concurrently with my academic position at Carnegie Mellon, I direct and research Epiphyte Lab, as Junie mentioned, which is the studio's work is focused on design of built environments through the lens of thermodynamic behaviors, framing architecture as an extension of its ecosystem. Epiphyte here serves as a model of attunement with the environment. Just like some orchids or plants, epiphyte, do you guys know what epiphyte is? I had to teach Junie how to pronounce it. No? Who knows what epiphyte is? 3. That's it. Okay. So epiphyte is a non-parasitic plant that lives and adapts these biological environments and feeds off the waste to survive. So it kind of allows for this model of inscription as a kind of a systemic model that suggests formal material organization, behavioral, performative constraints, and kind of its own expression. Some of the orchids or air plants are epiphytes. So it suggests this model of what I call ecological intimacy, which is a concept related to Bennett's writing on vibrancy in political ecology of things. So operating between practice and academia, there is kind of a structured yet slightly ambivalent allegiance of a project within a set of kind of these categories that you see on a screen that want to engage larger context through formal behavior, data, metrics, and the use of code, but vary in scale, type, and materiality. So on the side of academia, there's sort of research engages procedures, whereas on the side of the practice, it's more about a scale through experiences. So collectively, the body of work situates architecture as a kind of ecologically engaged system, drawing on connections between perceptive form and its contingency on invisible forces, in which inscriptions of its attunement engage spatial politics. So one example being the nature of energy processing in ecosystems that suggests that mature systems are much more complex and able to capture and retain energy, were more stable than juvenile systems. There's a kind of a difference between the rainforest and a cornfield, where in cornfield, the solar energy is processed much less effectively and in its kind of configuration than a kind of a complex system of the rainforest, and doesn't require the fertilizers and maintenance for it to survive. So in practice, this affects spatial distribution relative to the thermodynamics. Here in this particular project with focus on reducing dependency on mechanized systems, where the thermal mass here is kind of formulated as a replacement for mechanized air conditioning. And it's shaped strategically to kind of increase and decrease the thermal transfer and delay in the summer and prevents overheating. So my interest is in kind of shaping and distribution of the materials relative to the natural processes to instrumentalize these various expression in context of performance, politics, aesthetics, and its collective perception. These prototypes relate to thermodynamics of color and temperature, are supported by electromechanical actuation, can be connected to specific biofeedback using research into human psychology and emotiveness to explore subjective models towards collective control systems, thus allowing kind of reframing of mechanical system control in a built environments towards more adaptive and distributed systems. So not one system is a solution for all. Whether this relates to internal thermoregulation, so this is kind of architecture as a mood ring, the idea of kind of a thermoregulation through human presence and mood. So right now, I'm like completely freezing in this room, just like everybody else. So this idea, whether that's internal or external, such as a relationship to the living systems. So what are kind of the methods of inquiry is foundational in positioning the role of technology as a kind of distributed and engaged systems, where material identities allows us to cross over to new forms of materialism. And how that kind of invention through these hybrid methods of investigation then can be used to, or give us ability to start identifying the figures or trends that allows for, in kind of, this is an older project, the kind of a figuration of a thermal mass that allows for kind of a procedural generation of the system to assign a potential, kind of generating of a potential of a thermal values for kind of contextually specific or climate specific geometries with a thermal lag. So these new set of tactile experiences we can kind of discovering through the exploratory work. And in this framework, the vibrancy and identity of design aesthetics become kind of critical aspects of social and environmental engagement, which is tightly coupled with the histories of a place, labor practices, and contemporary manufacturing paradigms that are transforming redistributions of labor and thus repositioning architecture as a vehicle of ecological and communal resilience, while also raising awareness of construction of architectural objects in the context of their carbon footprint and the socio-ecological placemaking. So there's a kind of a path towards environmental empathy through the language of aesthetics that offers new forms of connectedness with other and familiar, which has both a tactile and kind of quantitative interconnectedness through the methods of investigation, while allowing us to design high-stake caretaking and retool both the work and pleasure in time of social and ecological crisis. The connection between architecture and landscape, or material systems and large-scale ecology, is critical to heighten our awareness of cross-scale relationships between human habitation, industrial manufacturing, and extraction of resources, as well as to offer both design cues and new sensibilities towards specific social contexts and urban frameworks in support of architectures that engage urbanization strategies rooted in natural processes and limit extraction needs that support self-determination and decarbonization. So the use of drawing and simulation as a kind of in a form of image has always been critical in this effort to collapse the behavior and a figure. And this kind of drawing always straddles empirical and metric-based input, navigates a kind of visceral ambivalence towards the tension between determinacy of data and the ineffability of the sublime. So this framing kind of situates the research within a graduate program that I have been developing for the past few years, which I called Master in Science in and Beyond Sustainable Design. The and Beyond is kind of secret title of the program that is not institutionalized. And the program that is centered on kind of architectural response to climate change, expanding or really investigating the investigation. So it's really focused on methods that position built environment as an applied ecology across scales. So the kind of a transscalar relationship of drawings on regenerative potential between specifically material and landscapes in response to kind of a setting up of the ecological metrics really transformed the program over the past few years. This is a development through, there's a little time frame down on the bottom. The kind of a drawing a connection or the framing between the particular scale from sort of materials all the way to ecological territory to looking towards the ecological impact and diversification of the research methods that starts increasingly rely on some of the machine learning and AI strategies. So these models that we work with are always rooted in the idea of geopolitical instrumentality. We work with we look for the patterns of cell formation using circle resourcing that is locally contextual, such as food waste, or reactive responsiveness in case of environmental health, of bioinvocation with natural materials that start kind of combining different material realities and chemistries, which also allows for kind of visceral vibrancy through the color effects. And a kind of a creative approach to ecological metrics. These methods generate kind of a tacit knowledge across scales that can be embedded in the simulated image that conditions and maps behavior of a natural processes and allows sort of a mediated understanding of these dynamic systems. The image carried as a kind of a layered information through varied algorithmic logic that can be used as exploratory. In this case, the sort of a tactical sedimentation of both a physical simulation and computational simulation to start understanding the health of the biological systems, underwater systems, or it can be used as a kind of a solution-driven data, such as using satellite data and computer vision as an input to address issues of strategic green infrastructure applications. So, so this approach specifically uses machine learning as a subset for AI, which is kind of enabling machine to learn from data without explicit programming. So the bigger kind of umbrella of this way of thinking, or how the projects are situated, this is one of the examples that connects research, collaborative practice, and community engagement. It's a research project called Crumble, which stands for Construction, Rubble, Manufacturing for Building Life Cycle and Environment. Looks at the kind of a novel cradle-to-cradle design processes for ecological architectural utilizing construction waste and earth and materials through the use of advanced manufacturing. And this research focuses on a regional impact of material reuse and the shape factor in designing kind of a low-tech material systems with a specific performative qualities, but it also engages factors of environmental justice and collaborative co-authoring with the community organizations to create engagement pathways within a community that are affected by environmental pollution in promoting more sustainable development practices, focus on self-determination through creativity. So there's kind of a collaborative design process that engages both the teaching of the design thinking and teaching of the technologies. So this is kind of one example of structural entanglement of a technological innovation and community empowerment that allows us to sort of rethink the role of technological determinism and its impact on our culture and technological elitism that allows for, that it's kind of brought forward by our institutions. So asking these questions and exploring early design solutions, it's both a form of a kind of creative investigation, but also a thinking through the sort of, or experimenting with these technologies. This is one of the pathway through the Rocking Cradle projects that is the urban furniture project that was interested in increase of biomass growth. That we, a few years back, we started looking at the style transfer as a way of ecological feature transfer. So Rocking Cradle, we kind of carried forward some of the technologies for mapping of water and hydrological and geological processes in a figuration into the articulated surface that used sand printing and kind of adapted sand printing as a technology to engage with the landscape. So the kind of idea of the landscape waste adaptation into these carrying objects that create visual intuition for the ways in which the landscape behaves. And so these sand-printed vessels are integrated into the public tree nursery. They become kind of an ecological infrastructure that are directly informed through these simulations of hydrology and geology, and allow for environmental stewardship through the instigation of the urban play. The project is part of the Pittsburgh Park development, conceived as a community nursery, where we wanted to explore kind of alternative models of community and ecological participation. So we conducted, this was kind of a collaborative process with our partner, who's an environmental justice artist, where the children were essentially creating part of the imprints into the objects themselves. They were learning how to use an image as a way to place on an object to start kind of creating one's mark or gesture that becomes part of their own. The other part was also for us to start looking at the kind of effectiveness of these techniques in terms of the biomass integration, using some of the machine learning models. In this case, the CycleGAN that uses like two neural networks as a generator and discriminator to compete and generate new data samples from the training data. So we sort of look at the characteristics of the hydrology that enables the lichen growth. Lichen is a bioremediator as much as it kind of creates the sort of a layer of growth on the object. And the idea here being that there's a kind of a directness to the pattern that allows for the ecological engagement and that conditions the biomass growth and allows us to kind of predict or build not just for a human, but built for a specific ecology. So these studies were done about 3 years ago, and as a kind of augmentation, parallel study or augmentation for these vessels, and this is a kind of a current state. Oops, I'm like one slide behind always. This is a kind of a current state of growth that is more recent. So all these techniques, I'm trying not to go too deeply into each individual project, but really just kind of create an overview of how the processes of investigations that start kind of channeling towards some of the pedagogical approaches that then trickle down to, let's say, undergraduate design thinking, where we can kind of start connecting the generative AI and a kind of augmented design instrumentalization towards the spatial model. One of the issues that happens when you try to connect material research towards the kind of a prototype building is that there's a sort of a limitation to its application, both in terms of design thinking, but also in terms of its impact in a larger scale. So here, where the kind of the magic of the instant image through the fusion models, and in context of just very simple understanding of a kind of a translation of a two-dimensional to into three-dimensional drawing becomes really interesting as a kind of a design sketch, right? So the algorithms of depth mapping and understanding image as a kind of a intentional creation of a data that starts producing a spatial connection, whether that's, in this case, is kind of urban systems, allows us for being deliberate or creating kind of a framework of constraints with from the performance to the materiality. So how the image actually produces a physical model. So there's a kind of a circular logic here that focus on translation of physical prototypes with a specific material logic to the architectural and spatial ideation. And the big idea here with the student work is to really curate the AI tools with while requiring a translation of material fidelity between image, materiality, 2D and 3D. So we use many tools that really require just kind of a basic understanding of these processes that are now very common, from sort of input process to understanding the language model through the clip model to kind of a control geometry sets and video generation to understanding of a 2D to 3D models. So the process itself always is an attempt to, or starts with capturing the embodiment of the material research. So kind of what is the form of making that takes on related labor practices, in this case, sort of use of recycled formwork in terms of the casting and the growth, to before engaging with the tools and workflows, to sort of understanding how you direct the process consciously, and the kind of a that's sort of very preoccupied with a very specific spatial imagination in a concrete context, and limits the exploration of the constraint set of variations. So whether that's urban constraint or it's material interpretation. So with this in mind, I'd like to kind of very quickly show last two examples of studio and a research project we're currently working with on looking at a which is titled Micro Repair, which is a studio focused on kind of a bottom-up regenerated growth system, in collaboration with the local community organization that situated with a declining neighborhood faced with environmental pollution and decay. Here, the kind of material research in mycelium allows for bioremediative and binding abilities of mycelium that is both the that is looking at the reuse of a current material systems in connections with the kind of a physical prototypes and growth models. So start actually growing the physical materials first to generation of the spatial model through image curation. So this is kind of the final collections of the student work that started with the physical prototype and understanding of a context of a AI augmented design process that starts thinking, well, kind of understanding these labor practices of like, what is what I call a weak structure, meaning what is the kind of a bundle of construction waste that allows for the thinking of a construction material, and in its both structural compressive strength, form of aesthetic, and serves as kind of a regenerative process where the design thinking allows, or AI kind of augmentation allows for controlled image generation with the set of information where that image becomes easily translatable in its kind of fidelity into the spatial model. So another example, this is kind of an example of a nest-like structure that allows for repurposed framing material and kind of a binding model, as well as using earth casting and grading as a part of a form making. So currently, this is happening in the context of regenerative material research into mycelium-based composites that take on kind of a rubble repurposing in a context of a kind of a gabion wall building as a building material, with very specific calibration and testing on binding and structural capabilities, as well as it combines sort of a layer of performative capabilities of the kind of a form and texture and organization to engage the local ecology. And so what's the sort of a limitation of what the kind of the work in with experimental work with the studio limits the these design processes to kind of a large interpreted model. So what we're starting to do is through directed training, kind of capturing the capacity of these models towards more directed spatial imaginations. And this is perhaps more difficult as it seems, and although these images are like very naive in its actual architectural reality, but it's kind of trying to essentially collapse the performative abilities of the material into the spatial imagination, while kind of through the choreography of the images to build in a kind of constraint of a specific sort of site program labor practice, through which would require a kind of another layer of models in more kind of design collaborative space. So to direct this capacity more intentionally towards both generative imagination, but also criteria that are space related and kind of possible to gain the kind of constrained, more directed investigative way. So it's not that different from what currently is kind of happening with the generative AI. Really, the intention or kind of a curiosity here is to think through this process as a kind of connecting the impact, connecting the kind of creative exploration to the ecological impact, and in a shorter period of time. So to kind of move away from the kind of the forms of hallucinations that are interesting in a different context, but for us to that's not necessarily where we're going with this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Donna. Are there any questions from the audience? Maybe I'll start. So I think, Donna, whenever I look at your work, there are two big things that always stand out to me, which is one is material, and then the other is the AI, or the more digital, let's say. And I think in a lot of the projects they show, there's interesting ways in which you try to combine both. Do you see these, the materiality, which is naturally physical, and AI, which is necessarily digital, I guess? Like, how do you see these things combining in your work in the future? And is there a way these things could combine to maybe inform each other? Or is it just always kind of like a linear process where you generate some sort of 2D image, 3D model, and then you kind of materialize it using the material? So for example, is there a way to embed material information into the AI process or vice versa?
So for me, the kind of a knowledge or the curiosity really goes into thinking through the material and behavior. So, which is really linked to understanding how we kind of live on this earth much lightly. So if you, I didn't go into the early kind of research framework of the projects where you look at the kind of, let's say, figuration of the form relative to the energy modeling, right? Or, and how that relates to particular kind of robotic fabrication processes and the molding processes. It's an older work that I feel has been sort of propagated previously, but in some way there is a kind of a pattern emerging from that work that starts that is in the context of AI becoming kind of a feature within an image. So what it allows for with a kind of a with the body of research is that image starts carrying multitudes of layers that has both performative, material, and ecological embedded within it. So right now, what I'm really interested in, and this was always been hard previously, because as you know, it takes so much within a constrained economical system, especially with an institution with a certain model of funding, to then scale up and do a proof of concept on a large scale, right? There's a kind of an institutional constraint that, you know, for example, you mentioned the ETH, right? It's a very different economical model than we have here at the Carnegie Mellon University that our state schools have, right? So in some way, what I think is interesting about the kind of a curated machine learning processes that we're engaging right now is that it allows for scaling up of and visualizing the impact and testing that impact within a constraints of not like, let's imagine, right? And this also, let's imagine what things could be, but let's imagine what this particular research could do. Like the project on like regenerative capacity of mycelium, the idea there has to do with engaging the kind of a community bottom-up learning of like almost do it yourself if you know how to do it, right? So there's a way where you can start sort of prototyping and building the physical systems if you know where you're going. So there's connecting both the imagination, it's connecting the easy ability to in some way develop these images if they're controlled and constrained by the behavior that system allows. So that's why I'm saying it's not necessarily kind of a critique of hallucinations, which I honestly enjoy and love. It's more that this particular investigation really looks at a kind of a pragmatics of how do we build with these new systems that we really don't know how we haven't built with, right? What does it entail? What are the possibilities of the kind of a way of living that allows, let's say, you know, within the neighborhood that we're talking about, the kind of a urban approach to regeneration of the old and abandoned, that it's essentially a part of the circle of waste that it's polluted, right? So to me, those things are wicked problems. They're very hard. They're very hard to even think about as similarly to the kind of the problem of economies that we have on like a large cultural scale between South and North. there are sort of localized problems here which are equally difficult. So to me, that's the relationship that I think the AI allows us to now visualize more rapidly.
I just want to congratulate you because I really like the connection between AI and data fabrication that normally you don't see. Sometimes you see like isolated the AI and the visualizations, and this visualization looks like super complex, so the people think they are not able to build it. And then when you add this data fabrication connection, then the students started to see possibilities. They are started to build maybe just a little module, but then in the future it's possible, or maybe like you can scale it to and maybe you are not going to cast the entire like module as the AI are showing us, but maybe it's starting to help us to imagine that it's absolutely possible to build with this kind of facades and materials. And I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, honestly, in context of your presentation, it's, we're doing very similar research with a lot of food waste and other kind of waste that some of it I can get into right now, right here. But the issue always becomes the kind of a limitation of the research, the kind of separation of the material research from the application, and even within an industry, right? So to me, and also it comes down to the kind of ethics of data training, where you look at the generative AI as a kind of co-opted systems of information, that some of it is with permission, a lot of it is without permission. So to me, getting to the point where we can train our own data and we can be like very narrow and specific, it might not necessarily produce the kind of particular exuberance of like, I've never seen this before. I mean, in some way, I feel like we live already in such a fiction that kind of creating a more fiction is less interesting to me than kind of an understanding of a constrained set of materials that we can train. However, that process of self-training it's so technologically intense that even within a architectural studio, it's not so simple to have that accessibility, to sort of understand. Like, less control you have, more exuberance you can build. More control you have, harder it's to be directed. So to me, it's more about, not necessarily about kind of a control of everything, it's more kind of understanding the directed capability of a design where it's become creative and informed.
Thank you, Dana. I have to take on, when I was listening to your presentation, I started trying to connect this idea of ecology, materiality, material intelligence, and everything resonates with this idea of resiliency. So there is a theory of complex systems where you have a source and everything is around the source, and we started consuming the source, and in order to the system to be healthy, there is always a need of chaos. There is always a need to have an event. And then resilience is being measured by how well you're able to re-initiate after the chaos. But then the system, there is a moment where we consume everything in the source, and then the new, but when everything is in static movement, then you create a system. So that's why I want to go back to your framing of ecology. Right? This is the way that your projects are trying to react to an environment. And we know that this environment is chaotic. I want you to reflect on how, what's the materials role into reacting to these environments, because I have the feeling that yes, the geometry is important for your project, but I think also the thinking behind what type of material for a particular project it's really trying to create a resilient or a kind of a narrative that can tell us a little bit more than just creating this project or this. I was working with the. It looks like a bench, but I was.
Oh, the rocking cradle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I feel there were more than one questions. So a lot of the reason why oops, this is the wrong one, this one. I keep thinking I'm on a very different image. So if I keep describing the wrong slide, then I apologize, but I just realized that right now, so I guess it's too late. But the reason why I wanted to put up this slide, because it kind of demonstrates the diversity of the different projects that range from very low tech to kind of high tech in terms of kind of combining. These are different theses within a graduate program that I lead. And and they're all rooted in the kind of a metric of a particular data set. And the data set is very contextual. So whether that is thermal mass of the RAM wall system, right, that is then connected to the particular geopolitical system that it's done through, investigated through not just material composition, but through kind of adaptive low-tech formwork that allows for the variation, but it's really looking at a labor practice of the formwork that is actually hands-on, where the kind of a computational overlay is much more in instrumentalization of the design to allow kind of sequencing of that formwork to then produce particular thermal conditions, right? Or if it's about the bio indication, where the kind of exuberance of the color of combination of mycelium and bioplastics using food waste allows us for thinking about the particular bacterial conditions and where the shape of the wall itself, because of the thermodynamic and conductive behavior of the interior wall. One of the reasons we're cold is because everything's flat here. It allows for the kind of a color change, which becomes both communication, so it's an indication of the knowledge, right? And also it becomes an aesthetic code, right? So I think we're so disconnected from the behavior of natural processes that we don't necessarily read ecology as information. We read ecology as decoration. So, for example, lichen is an indicator of the pollution levels within an environment, right? So there are kind of layers behind, and I said, this is kind of an embedded within each of the projects and contextualized within each of the projects, that information is used to understand how the shaping happens, what material is used, how it's choreographed, whether that's on the kind of a scale of material prototype or whether it's on a scale of kind of a large landscape territorial system, which deals with the land loss, right? So there's a kind of a incredible amount of GIS data that is looking into combining, let's say, MICP processes as a kind of strategic, what's the least amount of industrial implementation and where do we put it, right? How do we inject the MICP into the land, which is a large industrial process, right? But what it will allow, because of the tendency of sedimentation and kind of for us to understand the kind of tactics of that sedimented landscape, how it can be self-maintained. So the question that resilience is hugely specific, right? So that's kind of the one. The question about the rocking cradle, and I didn't go too deeply into the rocking cradle project. It was both, right? These vessels kind of collect water you can plant a tree, you collect water, you pour it out, and you go water the tree, right? So there's a kind of interactivity between the object and the landscape that operate on a multiple levels. This is supposed to be this. I mean, I love and hate this project because on one hand, it's both success and failure. I think that we build these relationships, social relationships and working relationships with people we worked in this with. There's like a lot of kids work on these where we taught kids how to use Photoshop. And like literally the fact that you can model images as textures and you can like show elementary school kids how to make an image and turn it into an object in a very simple way suddenly became part of the kind of like, I can design this and then I go there, it's my graffiti, right? Like it's my object that I can then associate myself with. So, and it's so tiny, right? Because it's like, it's too small, right? But in some way it was a prototype for collaborative process where technology was a kind of an underlay of communication. And the kind of, and at the same time, this was supposed to be a project that allow for kind of wildness of the tree nursery and the trees to be then used for neighborhood in a larger scale. So there's kind of an exchange of the trees into the neighborhood, et cetera. It's not happening because landscape being manicured, development's happening. It's not as accessible as it wanted to be, right? So as much as the process itself was, I think, incredibly valuable to us, the project itself in some way is a failure on its own because it's not necessarily maintaining the kind of a social impact that we were hoping for. However, the lichen is growing on it, right? So the kind of a cycle again study was really a study of sort of like, oh, we have these hydrological processes. Can we change or kind of amend the patterns to allow for this to happen, right? And so they're kind of, it's a very layered system. And so I can just talk about the technology part, I can just talk about the social part, I can just talk about the material part. But each one has its own identity, right? There's kind of a subjectivity to each of the process that I feel on its own can create a kind of a collective subjectivity of things that are so different that none of them are applicable to each other in its objecthood, but they're interconnected through the kind of a pattern recognition, which hopefully has some level of resilience.
Sorry, my voice is kind of like fading out at the end of the panel, but thank you so much for your talk. I have a question on because you have shown such a breadth from the material explorations and the explorations of the design, the surfaces, playing with ecologies and living systems, and then all the way to machine learning and generative AI. So there's like a massive spectrum. And what I've been thinking about in your presentation is that there's almost like two substrates at work that are at play both on the kind of like a material, like living matter, like lichen, the kind of the micro porosity and structures of concrete, the possibility of inhabitation, like the kind of material intelligence that like we find in the complex environment and that we are embedded in nature. And then on the other hand, we have this kind of other kind of substrate, which is language, kind of like how do we talk about things, like a lot of substrate of like people discussing stuff online, captions on images, how like Clip is trained, how all of these generative models are trained. So it's kind of interesting. Like, do you, like in the work of the artist Kay McDowell, there's this hope I read at some point that maybe like AI, despite being so language first, kind of like could also help us connect to some extent to this kind of like natural environment, but also it seems like there's like a massive rift apart between like our anthropocentric kind of like way of describing things and the beautiful complexity that we find when we go into the outdoors. So yeah, I don't know. Do you see that there's a possibility for reconciliation? Is there a bridge, or do you think these will be realms apart?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. You know, I think that the large language models are new tool that we still have to master and learn. It's also like a new form of poetry that has a very different meaning depending on your discipline and depending on your form of engagement, because in some way everything's an image and nothing means, and anything means nothing, right? It's all open to interpretation. So for us to start kind of for us to start sort of being deterministic about those processes, you have to set up the framework for the collaboration and whether the AI is collaborator or not. But you know, with this question, I'm reminding by the kind of a Stochastic Parrots article. I'm sure that there's a familiarity with this, which is the sort of a article by Emily Bender from like 2021, where there's a kind of critique of the large language models as systems that sort of statistically mimic text, but they don't necessarily produce meaning. And to me, the generative AI with images, it's in some way it's a similar process, right? It's a kind of a mimicking of a simulacra, the space that we inhabit, and it only exists as kind of a projection towards something that we are trying to construct, right? The kind of intentionality of the language and kind of intentionality of the matter, intentionality of the whatever the project is. So when I start working with the students, especially in a kind of context of a generative AI workflow, the confusion always becomes the sort of a completeness of the image relative to the understanding of a sketch and association of the sketch or image relative to the kind of a precedence, right? So how do we think about the history? What is kind of a historical knowledge that is critical to the production of that image? So a lot of images that I make them do are sort of collages of the images that start associate, just like hand sketching, right? Like we learn, there's kind of, it's very similar to me, but it's a different, there's a shift in cognitive model between the hand sketch and interpretation of a hand sketch and a digital image and an interpretation of a digital image. And the layers we understand both as kind of like the depth, the pattern, the structure, et cetera, right? So I do a lot of depth map modeling with them that it's outside of the kind of a 3D generation with the AI for them to understand like what is the kind of a datascape that they're working with, that it's not about the representative values of the image, but it's about kind of a computational structure of the image that then can start producing through these, you know, computer vision algorithms that we all use and we're not even aware of, some of us, right? Whether it's image recognition, it's all computer graphics. It's been, you know, and it works for many, many years. Back from when it was the first rendering was like 1970s, I think. It's like Cornell. So, so to me, it's just another kind of expansion of a tool set and framing of the knowledge. And because a lot of, and how, if we understand that that's what it is, then one can start having the conversation. And it's the same thing as if we all do some form of interdisciplinary design work, whether that's in the kind of a cultural or more engineering workspace, the language becomes critical to constructing the connection and a meaning, whether you work with mathematician or whether you work with artists or whether you work in community engagement, right? So to me, the kind of a danger of stochastic parroting is something that I feel a responsibility as a, let's say, educator to address in a pedagogical framework.
Any other questions? No? All right.
Am I done? All right, thank you.